What we wanted to do in the second half of this, or the second part, not really half, of the meeting, is to come back and spend some time with everybody talking about a topic that is a core element of the thing we've been working on around employee engagement. We've gotten tremendous support from OPM in helping work with us on this. Catherine Archuleta, who's the director of OPM, would love to have been here today, but she is actually traveling. But John, you can help represent the great work you guys have been doing. Just by context, I know for the folks on the PMAB, they probably know this, but perhaps for the folks on the webcast who don't, because I know the folks around the table have heard a lot from us on this topic. The people and culture element of the management agenda is something we've heard from everybody even before I started, when the discussions around the agenda, everybody from cabinet secretary to the front line, to the folks on the President's Management Advisory Board, to sort of every person in between said, great ideas about IT, great ideas about efficiency, great ideas about economic growth. If you don't have talented people engaged in the work they're doing, if you're not really leveraging the leadership core, if you're not thinking about how do you leverage the talent in the federal workforce, it will all be very nice and nothing will happen. And we completely agree with that. And so there's a number of prongs around the management agenda, but a core element of it has been really focusing on employee engagement. Because we firmly believe, I know from my prior life, I believe that employees that are really engaged in the spirit of, committed to the work they're doing and feeling like they are positioned to do their best work is what makes an enormous difference in performance. And you can find lots of statistics from the private sector about how that correlates to higher revenues or better productivity. You can do some of that inside. There aren't as good statistics outside, but I am firmly of a believer that actually really that this is a huge differentiator in performance. We've gotten a ton of work from OPM and all the agencies in terms of using the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey as a tool in that process. It is not the end in of itself, although we do have a goal about improving our engagement scores, but it's really because that's the best indicator we have of what we're doing. And so we have been doing a lot of work with agencies around this topic. We have gotten support from OPM to be able to both get the data. We've gone from starting with several hundred to over 10,000, 21,000 units that can get their actual scores down at the level. We've given access to unlocktalent.gov, which is a great tool, to every single SES in the federal government. They all got an email again last week after our meeting with the SES Advisory Board of here's how you get there. It also, besides giving them access to the point someone made earlier, we can also actually track the stats of who's accessing it and whether they're using it, which is a very helpful thing to know. And we have also asked every agency to appoint a senior accountable official and to develop their own tailored plan around employee engagement. And so what we wanted to do today is take advantage of the folks here who I know have worked on this in very different organizations and get the benefit of your thinking. And we actually asked for volunteers, and we had a few more, but we started with Education and HUD, who raised their hands first, so they got to come, to talk about some of the particular challenges and opportunities that they're facing, like at their agency, and try and get your input on how the challenges they're working through and where they're going. The materials have a page which is a little bit, we were trying to set some context for the agency, who they are and what they do and how big they are. But I'm going to turn the floor over to Andrew Jackson from the Department of Education. We'll spend about half our time on education. We'll spend the other part of our time on HUD, and I would also encourage the rest of our colleagues here, again, please feel free to chime in with your ideas, suggestions, or your own questions. So with that, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Beth. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Management at Education, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic. It's something I spend a lot of my days thinking about, and it's something where we've got some really challenging questions. We're trying to get some insight into how we can think about it maybe a little differently. I just want to paint a very, very brief picture of the agency because I think it helps to put it in context. Our overall mission is promoting the quality and equity of the U.S. educational system. We are the smallest cabinet level agency with only 4,400 employees. although we have a budget of $68 billion, most of which is formula and discretionary grants, our operating budget is around $420 million. We have notably a $150 billion loan portfolio, and that translates to, every year we do about $150 billion in loans, translates to over $1 trillion loan portfolio. Over the last 6 years, we've seen a lot of progress in the overall education system. We're very excited to see where we've come. Dropout rates are historic lows. College enrollment is up, and we still got a lot of work to do, but we're very excited about where we've come from. On engagement specifically, just turning to the topic, we are very lucky, like many federal agencies, to have a lot of very dedicated employees, and we're fortunate to have seen a lot of improvement in the area of engagement over the last 4 years. We've gone up 4 percentage points on the engagement index. This is, I don't know how familiar you are with the process we use in the federal government, but there's a employee viewpoint survey that's taken once a year. The employee engagement index is one of the subsets of that survey. It's the questions of the survey that we believe are most indicative of how employees feel about the levels of engagement in the agency. So,
can you tell us what the level of participation in the survey itself is?
it varies widely from agency to agency, and our participation level is around 60 to 70%, varies from year to year. It's different from office to office. Some of our offices are very low, and that is an issue that we're working with them on, but that's the overall level.
Yeah, the government-wide rate is 48%, and it's in the high 40s most years.
One comment I would give you that we've found that was an interesting question, and it was used more on the NPS side, the Net Promoter Score side, that we used internally with employees, which was, would you recommend your friends to work here, and how strongly would you recommend? And doing kind of an internal NPS, we found to be a really good indicator of how our employees were feeling, because if they wouldn't strongly recommend their friends to work there, that really gave you a pretty clear signal.
That's a great point. It is one of the questions on the survey. We don't ask how strongly they would recommend, but it is a yes or no. Would you recommend this as a place to work?
I think there's some value in saying, are you a strong recommender or medium or low? I think I would consider thinking about it maybe slightly different.
That's helpful.
I just want to make an observation about this disconnect between the immediate supervisor and the leader.
Yeah.
So I've seen these two things in both directions, and if I had to choose one, I like this better, because all the data, everybody knows this, is, people don't leave companies, they leave their bosses. The supervisor is the one who has the immediate impact. I know that you consider this maybe suboptimal. I actually don't think it's as critical as the one on the left. So to me, I'd much rather see the boxes like this than flip them around. And I've seen situations where employees think highly of their senior leaders, probably because they don't have too much contact with them, and don't like the person who actually has the most impact on their life. So, it's good to try to address this, but I wouldn't sweat it too much, because this 75% is really good, I think.
Great. Well, thank you.
I would beg to disagree with my esteemed colleague here.
Good.
That I think 75%, the 75% is a real plus. I think there's room for improvement. I would also say that the overall participation rate in the 40s is abysmally low. I mean, I had 86%, and people took an 85-item questionnaire. I just think that it's the participation is in and of itself a vote on engagement in the organization.
Yes.
On the agency's senior leaders, I think this is, to me, a serious issue, and I'm sure you're focused on it. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on why people don't have high levels of commitment and feel that the senior leadership is able to generate that level of enthusiasm and support. Is it lack of message? Is it lack of contact? Lack of continuity? What's the reason, and is it viewed as something that's fixable or not?
So that's the very question that we are wrestling with. We have some hypotheses on this, which we hope to test. We'll be doing some additional pulse surveys and focus groups with our employees to try to get a little closer to what's in their mind. One theory that we have is that the concept of a senior leader is actually not that well understood. So we believe that a lot of our employees don't necessarily know whether we're asking about the head of the agency, the head of their division, the head of their subdivision, right? We don't know exactly who they think they're responding to. The survey itself actually indicates that we're looking for kind of the component head of the organization, the one that's sort of next down from the secretary. But we believe that most employees don't actually necessarily think about that as they're answering these questions. At least the anecdotal evidence leads us to believe that they don't necessarily know who they're responding to, which when you get to questions like trust and integrity, it's a lot harder, I believe, for most human beings to talk about whether they trust or feel levels of integrity from an amorphous group that they don't necessarily know who I'm asking about, versus when I ask about their immediate supervisor, they know who that person is and they have a very direct personal relationship with that individual.
Yeah, that's why I think, and I was assuming, maybe incorrectly, that this was asking about the head of the agency. And it's important, I'm not meaning to minimize it, but the further removed from the employee that it is, and especially in the government where they're probably thinking the head of the agency is going to be gone in 2 years. Again, it's important. I don't mean to suggest that it isn't, but I'm very encouraged by the one on the left, which is what really affects people day to day. And I don't disagree that 40% type participation rates are not good. But I thought you said in your department it was more like 70.
It's a bit higher, yeah.
Yeah.
And just a matter of clarity, it says there are 4,400 employees, that's total employee headcount?
In the entire agency, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think of that as a fairly small agency and a fairly small ability to impact. I mean,
Small daily impact.
I mean, meaning that with 4,400 employees, there's enormous potential to reach those employees
Yeah.
and have impact on those employees.
Absolutely.
If it was
Absolutely.
440,000, I'd have a different level of perspective. So it just seems to me there's plenty of opportunity would be my
We agree.
That's why they're here.
That's right. So I think that's one of the bigger questions we're asking now. I will say that over the last few years, we have invested significantly in improving the skill set of our immediate first-line supervisors, and I believe that that's partly what's reflected in this data. We've seen this score actually increase faster than other parts of the survey because I believe that by increasing the ability of supervisors to have difficult conversations with their employees, to give more immediate performance feedback, for example, to talk about the employees' use of their talents in the workplace and whatnot. We believe that we're beginning to see some of that pay off here, and we think we've got some momentum that we can continue to build on. We're struggling a little bit, though, to think about what strategies we might employ to try to have that impact on how employees feel about senior leadership, especially on questions like trust and integrity, earning respect, and then communicating agency goals from the senior leadership level. And I'd be curious to hear if you guys have any thoughts on things that you've done in your own organizations that might help us, or strategies that we haven't necessarily considered that we might want to deploy.
One of the main ones I would say is visibility, and I don't know how many locations there are, but how often does senior leadership actually visit locations and spend time face-to-face with employees with a set of messages that are responsive? And also I would say the employees get feedback on the survey, and what does the organization do to demonstrate that it is listening to the feedback they're getting? And so those would be just a few things. I think it all starts with visibility. You really have to be personally visible, and you have to build relationships with people at multiple levels and multiple locations.
I also think that it's important to include it in objectives of the senior leaders, their engagement scores and improvements in those. So it's about objectives, then about measurement, and then about some kind of reward system for those improvements. I think that's really important. I think on the engagement side, one of the very most important elements of employee engagement is communications. And this kind of gets to your point of visibility. And even, two-way communications is awesome if you can manage forums where there can be feedback within those. But even if you're providing the opportunity and the employee doesn't take it, it's viewed positively in terms of the engagement of senior leaders. So I think it is really important for there to be visibility, for people to be close to those employees, to give them the opportunity to communicate. And I think the other element that you need to be careful of is you need to ask employees how they want to be communicated with. So we got to a point where employees were saying, do not send me another freaking email, okay? I get so many emails from all levels of management, so it's helpful to ask, how do you want to be communicated with? What's the most efficient for you? And it may be different based on the tenure of the employee, so you have to be thoughtful about that as well.
Picking up on Ron and Sam's points, we often don't give people feedback on the survey itself. And, maybe one of the ways to address the senior leader issue is that the senior leaders, however that's defined, do town halls in which they report back, here's what you told us, here's what we seem to be doing well, here's what you're concerned about, and here's the action plan for how we're going to do it. And that's the visibility of the senior leader, showing that he or she is taking this seriously and is personally invested in it. And if you can, in fact, and I don't know whether you can in this environment, make it part of the leader's goals to get good engagement scores, that leader should tell the community that he's doing that, and that he or she is doing that, and is committed to improving and addressing. But I think closing the loop, people fill out these surveys and it goes into a black hole and they don't really know what's happening to it. But having town hall, there's no substitute for physically going to the sites, talking to the people, telling them what you heard, what you're going to do about it. Sorry?
That would also improve participation.
The other thing I would say is the accountability has to be with every senior leader to improve engagement, but I do like your idea of having you called it a senior accountable official. I don't know if it sounds pretty bureaucratic, but I do think it is.
It's a very government-y term.
It is really important to have somebody that is focused on it every day, because it's very hard for senior executives to be thinking about it and be thinking about how well have I been communicating this past week or month, and having somebody else think about it with them and for them. And that can be somebody that is in a communications type of role. It could be HR, it could be a combination of the two. Oftentimes it is. It's really important to have somebody whose day-to-day job is to focus on that employee engagement and help senior leaders with that engagement.
The only addendum I'd make to that, and it sounded like you wouldn't necessarily disagree, is you don't want to get into a situation where employee engagement is HR's job or communications job. I think what you're saying, Sam, which I agree with, is you need somebody who's fully focused on this, but for the purposes of supporting the leader. It's the leader's job, employment engagement. If it becomes like an HR function, you're sending a real nothing against HR people, but you're sending a message about its lack of mission criticality.
All leaders are accountable.
Right.
Yeah, the final point I would make is that it really has to be a part of the management process of the organization. And techniques I've used and others have used, I'm sure, include things like regular quarterly all-employee meetings, telepresence video, and creating a climate in which people can ask difficult questions. And I used a technique which I would tell people if I didn't get questions, every chair in the room was numbered, and I would start calling out the numbers. And I can tell you that did wonders for questions. And then when people ask difficult questions, and you always have to sometimes plan a few, you give that person a round of applause. I mean, you got to create a culture in which people will ask the questions everyone's thinking, but no one has the courage to ask. But making it part of the management process so that every quarter people expect they're going to be given an opportunity to understand the bigger context and bigger picture. What's gone well, what hasn't gone well. The other thing that we did was to build tools, again, for different levels of the organization so that the message was consistent, but level appropriate. And so we'd start with supervisors and managers quarterly, then we did all employees quarterly, and then every supervisor and manager was expected to meet with their staff and go through a set of materials that were prepared and were level appropriate. And I required an affirmative message at the end of the chain that your line of command had in fact completed that process. And by the time you do that, 6 or 7 years or 4 years, or however, people understand the messages, they understand that communication is taken seriously, and that you want their feedback, and that you won't agree with everything, you won't do everything, but everything will be acknowledged, spoken to, and communicated back.
Thank you very much.
really helpful. Some of the same issues, but
This is
not
so great, yeah. No, I wanted to say this is the most helpful PMAB I've been to. So thank you for your thoughtfulness. All of your feedback that you gave to Andrew is definitely relevant for HUD. I'll tell you a little bit about it. Have a couple of additional questions for you, but I really feel greatly helped by what you've been talking about. So thank you. Just really quick, I have Tawanda Brooks. She's our acting Chief Human Capital Officer, but she also is our SAO. So while it sounds like it is a person, and she is here, and she is a career human capital person. I'm really happy to have her sitting at the table next to me. Also, Laura Hogshead, she is taking on the role that Andrew has and that Brody has, and we're naming it something different, but she's basically over all of the management and administrative functions at HUD, sort of newly into that position. So I'm really glad that she is here. And she is a in and out of HUD employee, which actually happens a lot. HUD is just quickly about $45 billion a year. It's got almost 8,000 employees. All non-managerial employees are in a union, a very active union, and a somewhat, just to stay in this room only, disorganized union with 42 locals, and I've learned a little bit about what that's like. It's been really interesting. There are 64 field offices. We're in 10, and those are kind of amalgamate up to 10 regions. 2/3 of our staff are out in the region. 1/3 are at headquarters in what is called the second ugliest building in DC, which always makes you wonder what's number one. We think it's FBI, we're not sure. That's gonna get blown up, so then we're gonna get to be number one on something. I'm really excited. But so we are also, we're also here, and we get sort of voluntold or tasked because we are the lowest EVS score of any medium-sized agency. And that is for a host of reasons that I've been there about, not quite, a little bit over 100 days, that are interesting to diagnose. HUD is I'm sorry, employee engagement.
Viewpoint Survey.
Employee viewpoint
Sorry.
survey. So your data's coming out of this like government-wide set of questions.
Yep.
And the good news is that you can kind of compare and contrast different agencies. And then for us, the bad news is that when you compare and contrast, we're pretty much at the bottom for medium-sized agencies. We are not at the very, very bottom. So,
So just by context for the folks also who are watching on the web, the EVS scores are done annually. OPM publishes the agency level scores, and then there's a whole bunch of data that individual agencies can get at the component level, and then down to a subgroup level of sort of roughly 20. A work group, I think, has to have how many people, John, to be included?
At least 10.
At least 10. So those are not public, but the overall agency scores are public and actually receive a fair amount of visibility within this world, as they should.
Yep.
Around through work with OPM and agencies looking at them. But sort of there's a piece that's public, and then there's pieces that are, used more internally inside of agencies to
Yeah.
manage this. And it's based on this annual survey that comes out. So hopefully folks
It's quite
who are
useful. It's
watching-
quite useful for benchmarking. The sub units actually tell a different story from the, as you can imagine, from a math perspective, as the overall number. Certain subunits of HUD actually outpace the government average, and certain don't. And that's it's sort of a very interesting thing that with a lot of agencies that have multiple mission sort of focus areas, that happens. That happened at Treasury. One of our lowest scoring subunits is actually going through a very important transformation, which means that we're actually changing the way they do their business all across the country. And they're very unhappy about that. So I am hopeful that once we come to the other side of that, that actually will improve. That I saw that at Treasury as well. We had a bureau doing a lot of systems and process changes, and they had the lowest score. They're at the level bottom. So I don't know that this is a permanent state of affairs for HUD, but I do think that there are already things that you've mentioned here that will be useful. We only have just slightly over 50% participation in the EVS, so I think just getting that number up is probably going to be helpful. HUD's general goals, though, are very lofty, and homelessness, and veterans homelessness is one we're trying to accomplish by this year, and chronic homelessness by 2017. That's a pretty lofty goal. But we're also the back end, like Fannie and Freddie Mae, we actually are a financing vehicle also for multifamily and single family housing. So we have sort of technical people there, we have folks that are out in the communities trying to end homelessness, and then we also have just a couple of other, anything you can think, it's basically a catch-all for sort of urban and community programming. We have formula grants and competitive grants. So it's celebrating its 50 years today, so it's a much younger agency than Treasury, for example. If you look on slide 24, this is like what it looks like when you're in the lowest scoring agency. You get a 30% senior leaders and a 52% positive score on your immediate supervisor. So that comes out of one portion of the EVS. We are actually doing a multi-pronged strategy for all parts of it, but we are focusing on the employee engagement index because of what Beth said earlier, which is it's believed to be a leading index, and that if you address the 15 questions there, you will pull along everything else. And so these particular areas, though, come from like one subcomponent of that. We have engaged the Corporate Executive Board. They have done some really great analysis, but it's not just a report that's sitting on the shelf. It's actually a very good communication tool, and we're working with them to facilitate our action planning across the agency. Go ahead.
Can you do webcasts with all your employees?
And we have been doing webcasts.
I mean,
yeah.
I go back to what Ron started and Sam endorsed, which is, you've got to really be visible, both physically when you can, but I take the issue of the geographic diversity. But I mean, to Ron's point, there should be a rhythm where everybody expects to see their senior leaders on some kind of basis, ideally quarterly, but if that's not practical, maybe it's once a year in person and the quarterlies are webcast. Okay. But you've just got to, there's no substitute for constant visibility, reinforcing the messages. If you think you've said it too many times, it means you need to say it some more.
Yeah.
And they just have to see their leaders, and they have to know that their leaders care about what's going on and are addressing the issues that they hear about. I mean, this is all obvious, but use technology and make it the job. I think it was Sam who made the point. It's got to be, leaders have to be held accountable for doing this. We expect you to do X number of these town halls a year or what have you. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to follow on what you're saying. When you look at some of these scores, the first question you want to ask yourself is it clear to the organization what our goals really are and what we're trying to get done? Because when you see a 52% of managers doing a good job, you could have a competence problem, but I would start with there's probably not clear alignment of what is trying to get done. There's probably a pretty good gap in what the goals are. And I think that what we found is, because I saw groups that had numbers like these, and what we had to do is we started a process that we call engage that organization. So we started engage, then we would go to setting what the goals were going to be, then we'd explain specifically how we made the decision for those goals, and then we set the expectations, what everybody's role was going to be. But we had these numbers, and it was really that notion of we had to engage them in making sure they had bought into what we were going to go get done. Otherwise, these scores won't improve.
The other thing, and this goes back to something I think it was Andrew said earlier, that if this is the actual question, I don't know if it is or if this is meant to be illustrative, but I don't know what that question means. How good a job is being done by the manager? I mean, going to Enrique's point, a question would be, do you feel you have clear understanding of the goals of the manager or something? But how good a job could mean anything from, do you think they're competent, to are they communicating? Right. It's too broad a question to know what the answer really means, in my opinion.
Right. And that is the question. It's overall, how good a job do you feel is being done by the manager?
Well, I don't know what that means, because that could mean different things to different respondents. Some people could mean they don't think they're competent. Some people could think they're not communicating well to me. Some people could think they're not. It could be 100 different things. So I think specificity, you can't diagnose the problem without really specific data of what it is you're
trying to do.
Yeah.
How would you handle the situation, though, on goals? Enrique, I really appreciate that comment. We have several goals, right? So I mentioned ending homelessness, but we also have leveling the playing field for all Americans from all walks of life. That is implementing the Fair Housing Ordinance, which is also celebrating, it's going to be 50 years in a few years, 50 years old. So we have a part of HUD who is out enforcing fair housing rules, and in some instances are enforcing it on grant programs that are being implemented by HUD. Okay, that means that I have someone out there trying to end homelessness, and they build supportive housing units in a particular area, and it turns out they're actually violating the Fair Housing Act by doing that, because they're putting people of a protected class into a building. Now, we've been able to kind of work that through, but that is a very specific example, but there are examples of this throughout HUD where we have multiple goals, and sometimes they actually may be in direct conflict with each other.
So that'll create, that's a specific challenge. What I have also found, though, when you talk about kind of fair housing rules, you have to get to a certain level of granularity where people really understand what it means to them. And I've found that that's another breakdown. Like at the senior level, we have this clear vision of what we're going to go get done. And to us, it's like, oh gosh, this is painfully obvious. But then and we kind of go, why don't they get it? And the reality is they don't get it because it hasn't been translated into something that at the person who does the work at the end point, it hasn't been translated into exactly what it means to them. And we had to do a lot of work to cascade kind of our vision into the actionable items that people could really understand. And then they could say, yeah, I can see why my manager is doing a good job because he's holding me accountable to doing these 3 things that I completely understand. And so it's kind of decomposing that highest level objective into something that's very actionable at the bottom of the organization.
Yeah, I think I would agree with what Enrique said about the ideal. I'm not sure, given the nature of how this survey is administered, that you can get that level of unit-by-unit granularity. And one approach, if you can't, is to simply ask the question, do you know your supervisor's goals?
Exactly.
And do you know your own goals?
Right, and we are going to put into place a pulse survey so that we can get some quicker information, but we could slightly tweak some of these more broad questions to get to that, because I think that'll be helpful. We're sort of calling it like a clear line of sight, when the work that you're doing actually like rolls into an accomplishment, because
Right.
everyone at HUD is very mission oriented. That's actually a real asset of the staff there, but they feel very frustrated by, why isn't it working for us to get our work done?
I think
So-
I'm sorry, Ron, go ahead.
Would make is you need to make certain that you're giving people a level of what I'll call business literacy, meaning that they understand what the organization is there to do from a mission point of view. They understand how it fits together, and therefore they have a sense of understanding their role in a more mission-oriented, elevating goal. If they don't have business literacy, then a lot of the decisions that get made seem arbitrary and capricious in any organization if they don't understand the big picture. And so I would ask, is there a way to make certain people have literacy around what you're really trying to accomplish as an organization, particularly because people probably tend to work in one area and don't necessarily see other parts of the silo or other silos within the organization. And there's really, if you haven't seen something called learning maps, they're really a tremendous tool to simplify business and business processes. I use
These like
them.
mind maps, or are they like?
Learning maps.
Okay.
And there are different companies that do them, but
Okay.
we use one that illustrated to people the financials of the company. Where did money come from? Where did it
Where's it
go?
going?
What was it spent on? And where do things like dividends, things most people who answer phones have no idea, what these terms mean and how it works. We did one on customers, who they were, what was important to them, how they measured us, how we fared against competitors, one on products, one on strategy.
That's
But at the
wonderful.
end of it, we had 50,000 people who understood at a level of literacy about the overall enterprise. So they understood, if I'm answering the phone, this is what customers expect from me in terms of a level of service. So those would be just a few additional things
It's
to
wonderful.
think about.
Thanks.
A comment around the question you asked here in the middle on page 26. It
Yep.
sounds like you've got a pretty geographically dispersed workforce. And, I've always thought that the hardest job in any company was the frontline supervisor or frontline manager, because they're charged with taking those high-level goals and motivating a team around what they specifically need to get done that contributes to those goals. I think it's going to be really important for you, particularly with that geographic dispersion, to make sure that the frontline supervisors have really good tools, and they're given a lot of good information that's concise, because they're getting a ton of information. It just all rolls downhill, and you need to make it concise and help them as they talk with their frontline employees whether it's about goals or what the mission is or what we're doing today. They really need a lot of good communicational tools, and in many respects, they need much more, but concise, much more help than anybody else in the organization.
Great.
A comment and a question. Getting back to this whole issue of goals and the survey, so I agree with the comment that was made that you can't get into a lot of granularity in the survey about the goals. But I think it's really important that the goals that are end homelessness is a great inspirational goal, but what does it mean day to day to the person on the front line? So the responsibility of the people between the very top and the people that are actually, on the front lines is to translate those larger goals to goals that are very specific to the people in the organization. Right. So the people in the organization have to see two things, it seems to me. One is they have to understand the big picture, where it all fits in, what the overall goals of the organization are. And then they have to understand how what they're doing very concretely and very specifically relates to that big picture. And then when you ask a question on the survey like, do you know what your objectives are? Do you know what your boss's objectives are? There shouldn't be any ambiguity about what those are. So if the answer is no, I don't, then you know you've got a communications problem. Right. That's the comment. The question I have is, I don't know who you mentioned the Corporate Advisory Board. I just would throw out something to consider, maybe you've looked at this. Gallup does an engagement survey, and maybe you know this. The benefit of it is they have years of experience. They're not very good at predicting elections, but they have years of experience of refining these questions. And it also gives you the ability to compare your results to other organizations, both in the private and the public sector. And I suspect they wouldn't have written questions like this. So I don't know if you're using somebody to help you with this.
So we're using the OPM tool so that we can compare to other agencies. We actually brought the Gallup surveyor into Treasury a couple years ago, and he was really great. He was talking about some of their, they have millions of data points, and they've actually refined the questions. He also said, if you want to measure change, don't change the measure all the time. You know what I mean? So he was understanding our limitations, but I do think the pulse survey would be really helpful. The thing that I took away from talking to the Gallup people a couple years ago was surprising to me on engagement, which is the most important question is, I have a best friend at work.
Yeah, I know about
which
that question.
Which is surprising.
Which is,
right?
I've always thought that was a weird question.
It's right?
But
okay.
The question that Enrique was talking about, would you be a net promoter of the job? My only point is I'm not promoting Gallup in particular, but I just happen to know they do have a huge database. They have a lot of experience with the right questions to ask. And it gives you a consistency. There are other people that do this, so I'm not trying to advertise for them, but I would encourage you to get people in here who are really expert at this, that do it a lot.
It's helpful. Very helpful. I don't know if we went through all the discussion questions, but basically, and just so you know, the Secretary of HUD is fairly new to HUD. It's Secretary Julian Castro. He's been there maybe 9 months, 8.5 months. I've been there 3, so there is new leadership. Many of our assistant secretaries have been empty, and we're now sort of filling them with various, with leaders. So the leadership score could also be because there really was a missing middle leadership tier, but it also could be some of the other things that I'm really still diagnosing, I guess I would say. I'm not entirely sure. We're trying to cross-hatch this with qualitative information too, so that's been helpful.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
One question I'd ask you, as you have successes on this, the goal is so inspiring, right? End homelessness. But as you have successes, how do people share that? How does that get to some of the folks who are also in the trenches every day doing that job?
Yeah, so we are doing quarterly town halls, and the secretary has a successes profile part of that. And then we've done a little tiny bit better, although we could get much better on internal communication. This is sort of what Sam said earlier, which is ask people how they want to be communicated to. There is a really nice, lovely sort of newsletter style thing that goes out probably monthly, if not slightly more often. And it is all about, here are some things you might not have known about that happened in our Chicago field office or that happened in this area. We had 2 cities that actually ended veterans homelessness, so we profiled that sort of thing. And I do think we track all that. We have a lot of analytics data on the back end of that, so we actually know how many people actually opened it, how long they spent, Did they actually read the story? And we get a pretty good take-up rate when it is about, people are very curious about what other parts of the agency are doing. So I do think there's probably a way to amplify that, though, a little bit better. And I also have one final question for you, or one extra question for you, which is, we have 660 days left, something like that. No pressure or anything, but like, no. So the secretary asked for, on every speech that he gets written, exactly how many days are left on the very top, so he knows, so he's watching. And so like sometimes when they write talking points for me, they put it on top of mine too, and I'm like, oh. So what's your recommendation on, what do you do when you have a use by date, everyone else knows you have a use by date, because the Obama administration ends on a particular day. Any recommendations there?
Well, this came up earlier in a different context, and I think the comment that was made, which I agree with, is that if you establish something that gets traction and that works and that's effective and people are bought into it, then you have a very good chance of it being sustainable. And this is not political. This is about employee engagement. And I think, again, to me, the critical thing is to communicate in a very visible way that the leaders are taking it seriously and believe in it. And if it gets that kind of traction, the employees are going to want to keep it going beyond any particular administration.
I would just give you one other thought on this notion of you have a shot clock and it's going to expire, so to speak. And I would tell you, until the very last day, to the very last moment, you can affect somebody's life, and I would use that as the most important thing. And because you're in an amazing organization and your energy is fantastic, and I kind of feel like it's kind of like we're gonna work till that last moment because we changed somebody's life. I mean, I think it's great.
Yeah,
It's great what you do.
The other points I would make is that many of the things you are trying to accomplish are things that people in the organization themselves believe need to be done. And to the extent that you can involve them and make it their idea, there is more ownership and therefore persistence and continuity, because it's not being imposed as a good idea from Washington. This is what the organization needs and feels it needs to be effective. And the people who do the work know what needs to be done. And their big issue usually is nobody either listens or does anything about it. And so if you can make it theirs, you'll get much more persistency along with the other suggestions that have been made.
It's very helpful. Thanks.
Ned and then Ellen, then Ned. You hit the button first, Ellen. You beat him out on
You win the
Jeopardy.
game show, Ellen. Go ahead.
So just a
Employee
kind of
engagement for 400.
In the form of a question.
number 3 on best places, number 2 on best places
I
to
know,
work.
we
Excuse
know.
me. So a very practical thing we did, and we didn't do it specifically on employee engagement, but it's working out well. So when we rolled out our new strategic plan, a year plus ago now, under our foundation of how do we do things better, so we have 4 mission pillars, and then it's on a foundation of how do we do things better. One of the things the leadership, and this included the senior career leadership, came together around was, while the tone from the top is set by the secretary and the deputy secretary and the kind of most senior leadership, the actual driving and maintenance of the culture is in the hands of the senior career SESers. And we got very explicit around objectives and action plans that said, you own this. You are responsible for the culture we currently have, and if it's going to change, you are responsible for changing it. And that led to a bunch of thinking around getting the SES core together as a cohort, working through values, working through development for them. That is then starting to roll out to the levels of management below them. But I think it was a very powerful combination. Our secretary, Penny Pritzker, who's spent most of her life in the private sector, is absolutely committed to the idea that, and because we all live it, that employee engagement is part of managing your employees, and that is the job of line management. HR, and no offense, because you stole one of our best when you stole Tawanda from us. HR provides enabling developments, tools, thought, leadership, but it is a line management responsibility. And line management work is done at the career SES level. So I would just offer for others to think about how you tie those things together, because they are going to be here for the long haul.
Yeah, really helpful. Ned?
Beth, I'm triggered by the first of Noni's questions, how can HUD create a pipeline of leaders, and something Tony Scott said earlier about the need to generate leadership in the IT area. It leads me to a sort of a question and perhaps an ask of the members of the PMAB, and I first should tell you that I'm a Johnny-come-lately around here. I spent 41 years in the private sector before I joined the administration 5 years ago. The last three jobs I had were senior administrative jobs, executive jobs in 3 Fortune 500 companies, where I was a customer of all 4 of your companies, either directly or indirectly, and an appreciative customer. Yeah, you did. You did. I know all 4 companies, and yeah. Not so sure about that, but
His goal was to do it just in time. Time.
What I'm struck by and was struck when I was in the private sector, my private sector colleagues thought that public sector executives were sort of not very smart, and not very hardworking, and bureaucratic, and oh, by the way, overpaid. I get here and I find that my public sector colleagues think that the private sector executives are largely unprincipled, financially driven, corner cutters, and oh, by the way, overpaid. So we've been working on something with John and his colleagues' help, and Beth and we're working on a pilot to try to create interchange among executives in the 2 environments. I spent a lot of time in both places. Maybe I'm just missing something, but it seems to me if we could find a way to have private sector executives spend some time here, they would find out that the people here are not dumb, they're not lazy, they're really not overpaid. I will tell you that. I did compensation in the private sector. I was responsible for it at all 3 companies where I worked. These people are not overpaid. So if we could get advice on how better to create a better understanding between the public and private sector, and again, this is not political. This will survive whatever administration we have, whoever the president is. It's a problem that continues. And Tony's right, we're going to need people. And if you can help us figure out how to do that, we would appreciate it.
Well, my comment is, I think, I'll speak for myself, but I think all of my PMAB colleagues have said the same thing. As we've gotten exposure to all of the people that come to these meetings, right, it gives us a much better understanding of all the great people and all the great lessons that you have to teach us. And I think part of that is our own exposure. Quite frankly, we never had a chance to meet with you. I mean, and by getting a chance to meet with you, it probably works both ways, right? You get to see some of the things we do right and what we can do, and we get to see all the great things you guys do. And so I would encourage more of this in getting folks who have done some of the things we've done here and having them have an opportunity to interact with you, because we see how great the work you're doing is and how valuable it is and how hopefully we can help you a little bit and vice versa. So I think getting more engagement with senior executives here in Washington, I think will go a long way.
And I appreciate that. What I would hope to see over time is engagement at the level just below you, sir. Not the CEOs. I worked for 6 different Fortune 500 CEOs in my career, and I know what time they had and didn't have. But my colleagues, the senior vice presidents, executive vice presidents, they are the ones who aren't here.
Well, I'll give you another thought, though. There were some best practice visits that were done a couple times ago, and they came to our company. A group of people came and engaged with my team, and I think it was a really good exchange in both directions. And so I think it was some of those things they don't have to be with the CEO. They can be with our teams. And again, it's just exposure and visibility. It's having the opportunity. For me, when I hear this notion of we're here to end homelessness, right? That is an exciting idea. And I'd love my employees to hear that, because I think they'll feel good about it, and then they'll see the people working on it, and they'll feel good about that group of people.
I just want to endorse something Enrique said. And I've said this at prior meetings, I have just been truly blown away by the quality, dedication, commitment, competence, vision of the people that we've been exposed to, not just at the secretary and deputy secretary level, but in the SCS in general. And one of the maybe side benefits of this organization is that, speaking for myself, but again, I think my colleagues are like this too, in the business community, there are these stereotypes such as you describe, and we become a bit evangelical with our business colleagues saying, you know, you got it wrong. You don't know how good these people are. I really think your idea is one I would recommend, Beth, that we consider as a real work stream here. And, you know, I'm certainly willing to help. I think the more time, and the problem is that most people in business and government encounter each other in adversarial situations. And that doesn't lend itself to really understanding the other person. And I used to say when I was on the Business Roundtable and we would go to see congressmen that it was like one person speaking Greek and the other person speaking Latin. They just don't get each other. And that's because they have an agenda in that meeting. So this is an environment in which we don't have to have an agenda. We can just get to know each other. And I really, you know, we did some dinners at one time, but I don't know whether that's the right way to do it. Smaller group meetings, you guys figure out what's best. But I think your point is so important that both of these groups understand each other better and get past these stereotypes. And I would strongly encourage us to do that.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. One, I would say, like my colleagues, that I've been very impressed with the quality of leadership that I've seen here, and I would go further to say that you manage under a set of burdens and hurdles that personally I have no idea how you do it because your hands are tied in many. You don't have incentives. You don't have a lot of the tools that we have in the private sector. But as a young executive, when I was starting out in my career, it was not unusual for executives to go into public service for a year or two or three and then go back into the business community. And I think we need a way to bring people in and out sooner. And there are all types of very legitimate issues that have to be dealt with, conflicts and various things. But I think if we don't get people in earlier in career, that I know very few executive vice presidents, quite honestly, who would view it as an exciting assignment to go into government, given the experience they've had so far in their career. They might think of it as a nice second career or a way to give back. But I think it is well worth finding, you know, I don't know whether it's a foundation or some group who really views this as a very important societal issue, and that we need to put some time on task to think through and figure out how do we really structure something that brings in high potential, high talent individuals into government who may go on to other business careers, because it's great to have talented people in government. It's great to have talented people in business. It'd be better to have talented people who move back and forth between them.
So I will echo that. We're actually doing some things around that through programs like the Presidential Innovation Fellows, for one on the technology side, but I think there are more opportunities. I also, and I think that's a question we need to tackle and is on the agenda, but will take some time. But there's some stuff we can do in response to Ned's comments and all of your comments that I think are actually less time consuming and can get done fast with the 600 and blank days, which is I would ask the folks who are here, and we'll go back out to folks. I know this group and the members who couldn't be here are more than happy, and I think it is right. It is the level below folks in this room, whether it's specific things about, you know, moving things to shared services, operationalizing new processes, converting face-to-face interactions to ones that have a mix of channels. I'm looking at our friends from SSA. I'd love to, and you'll get a note from Brad over the next couple days that says, sort of give us your wish list in terms of these are the kinds of people I know. For example, when the customer service group we had in Denver, it was actually remarkably easy to get someone to do that. And in fact, the advantage of the fact that 85% of our federal workforce is not in Washington means that we could also do some things for folks who are not here, because frankly, not everybody's operations are based here. And so it's a way to actually accomplish a lot of different things, including, by the way, closing down some silos that exist within the federal government, because we could actually, take some of the functions that are shared and actually have them do this together like we're doing in Denver. So we'll come back with the ask, and it's very specific. This topic, I'd like to hear about this thing, right? It doesn't have to be fancy. It could be, frontline response in a call center. It could be simplifying the way we process complicated claims. I have this vision of creating a claims working group across the federal government, because claims and backlogs, as people might have read in the newspaper, are sort of a problem in many different agencies. And there's sort of a similar set of problems. There's lots of other lessons or at least ways of sharing ideas about how do you take, complicated requests for getting something resolved and get them resolved better and faster. That is not a political issue. That is a process management, lean process issue. So you will get a note back. I'd love to get people's responses. I'd love to get them quickly. So we'll give you a little bit of time, and then we will take those and sort those through and come back to this group. And then I think it would be a great thing, in the spirit of this committee, to come back and report out in this form about what we did and what we learned. So I think that'd be a really useful and very tactical and actually not that hard, right? Not that hard. And those are the kind of events we all know when you send folks out and they get that input, and sort of, I think part of the charge to them when they go is how do they bring that back to the rest of the people in their organization. So it's not just for them, but it's for others. So I think that is another really pragmatic and tactical thing. I think we are, any other questions, comments, requests? Because I think we're actually close to the end. And just a couple things. One, we've got a calendar at the back. I don't know sure what page it is because we never can get page numbers, 26. To print out our PowerPoint. We'll be back with this group at the end of June. What we wanted to just highlight here is there's some things coming. The employee viewpoint survey will be coming out soon. We do have a whole set of things engaged about how do we actually get response rates up. And I personally think one of the things that I've seen transform is as we've spent more time as a leadership group focusing on how we use the survey, I think that is a critical factor. And I know from our work with John, one of the things that drives response rates is people thinking that you care about what they have to say. And I can think of all the agencies here. It is very clear that people care about what they have to say and are trying to act on it. And I think as we go out with the survey and make that visible to folks, I am hopeful that we will see the response rates continue to go up. The Department of Agriculture, whom I had a meeting of all their senior leadership in the agency from around the country and globe, actually. This week, Krista, who had to leave, invited me to speak. And so it was great to see the whole leadership of the agency in the auditorium. It was all about engagement. And one of the things they had done is actually raise their response rate by, I think, 10 points in a year. And if you talk to folks, it's because the secretary talks about it all the time, and the deputy secretary, and the component heads. It's got to, that's a very federated organization. It's nice that the secretary talks about things, but if you're in, this piece, that's what you care about too. So it's got to filter down, and they've seen that in their response rate. They haven't seen it in their results yet, but I think it's a leading indicator. So we've got a bunch of things coming in terms of some of the work on benchmarking. So I'd like to thank the President's Management Advisory Board for taking the time to join us today, and for, as always, a really helpful set of comments that are both big picture and very tactical. And I love coming away from these meetings with that. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues from across the agencies for joining and participating, and for the good questions. I think we all walked away with our own to-do lists coming out of this one. I know I have mine. And I'd like to thank whoever joined us now or will watch this later for their interest. We are really committed. I know we are committed to an administration to doing this. There was a quote from the president not so long back about this is the fourth quarter. Really important things happen in the fourth quarter, and that's what this is all about. So we do plan to go flying into those, making the most out of those last 600 and some odd days, because we got a lot of really, really important work to do for America. So thank you very much for everybody. Have a great weekend.